The scream that emanated from the library came from Margaret Finlay, Catherine's housemaid of 12 years, who had entered to ensure the evening lamps were lit. It was a sound of such primal horror that it silenced every conversation on the lawn simultaneously, transforming the genteel afternoon into something altogether different. The guests froze like figures in a painting, wine glasses suspended mid-air, mouths open in interrupted sentences, the pleasant fiction of safety abruptly shattered. Richard Ashford was the first to move, though his movement was peculiar in its deliberation. He did not rush with the desperate urgency one might expect of a man learning his wife had been murdered. Instead, he set down his glass with careful precision, straightened his jacket, and proceeded toward the house with the measured pace of someone attending an appointment he had long anticipated. It was a response that, in its very composure, suggested volumes to those paying attention. Miss Marple, who had risen from her chair with the aid of her walking stick, observed this progression with particular interest. She had seen many reactions to sudden tragedy in her long life, and she had learned that shock rarely wore the mask of such calculated control. Most people confronted with catastrophe displayed some flutter of genuine disturbance. Richard Ashford's steadiness suggested either a man incapable of emotion or, more intriguingly, a man whose emotions had already been processed and filed away in some remote corner of his consciousness. By the time the doctor arrived, summoned by the vicar who had taken charge with the authority that the church still retained in such matters, the library had become a tableau of Victorian melodrama. Catherine lay as though arranged by an artist, her face peaceful despite the deliberate violence of her death. The scarlet ribbon, which Miss Marple recognized as the sort one might find in any haberdashery in London, had been wound with almost ritualistic precision. There was a quality to the presentation that suggested the killer had not merely murdered Catherine Ashford, but had made a statement in doing so, though what that statement might be remained, for the moment, obscure. Inspector Hastings arrived from the county town within 2 hours, a competent man in his mid-50s with the bearing of someone who had solved a respectable number of village crimes and harbored the confidence that this would be no exception. He established his headquarters in the drawing-room and began the methodical process of cataloguing facts and eliminating possibilities. His initial assessment was swift and, he believed, definitive. The ribbon, he announced to the assembled household, staff and family, appears to be the murder weapon. No signs of struggle elsewhere in the house. The library door was locked from the outside, which suggests the killer either knew how to manipulate the mechanism or possessed a key. The victim's jewelry remains undisturbed, which eliminates robbery as motive. He turned his considerable attention to Richard Ashford. "You were present at the garden party the entire afternoon, I'm told. Can anyone confirm your whereabouts between 4:15 and 4:45? Richard had regained some semblance of appropriate grief by this point, though his eyes remained disturbingly clear. "I was on the lawn throughout, discussing the harvest yields with Farmer Marsh primarily, though I spoke with several guests." "And your wife, did you notice anything unusual about her behavior?" Catherine excused herself, as she often did. She preferred to ensure her entertainments proceeded without visible effort, you understand. She possessed that particular breed of vanity that required everything appear effortless. The manner in which he spoke of his wife, with neither warmth nor rancor, but with the clinical detachment of one describing a piece of furniture, did not escape Miss Marple's notice. She sat quietly in the corner of the drawing-room, her knitting producing a steady rhythm of needles and yarn, appearing to focus entirely upon a particularly complex Fair Isle pattern. In truth, her attention rarely wavered from the unfolding drama. Inspector Hastings next turned his focus to the household staff. Thomas Whitmore, the groundskeeper, became the immediate center of suspicious attention. He was young, perhaps 30, and possessed the nervous energy of a man accustomed to labor, and decidedly uncomfortable with authorities' scrutiny. When questioned about his movements, he admitted without hesitation that he had been working in the garden shed preparing materials for the next day's plantings. "Anyone see you there?" Hastings pressed. "No, sir. I prefer to work alone if possible." This answer, honest and damning in equal measure, seemed to settle matters in the inspector's mind. a young man, unaccounted for, who had been observed in private conversation with the deceased woman mere hours before her death. Hastings was not a man prone to overthinking such coincidences. By evening, Thomas Whitmore had been taken into custody pending further investigation, and the household at Thornfield Manor had contracted into a state of anxious waiting. The guests had been sent home with instructions not to leave the village, and the staff had been confined to quarters. The garden party, that pleasant afternoon gathering, had become the prologue to a melodrama no one had anticipated. It was at dinner, a quiet, uncomfortable affair served in the formal dining room, that Miss Marple made her first deliberate observation aloud. She had waited until the servant S had cleared the soup course, until there was sufficient background noise to mask her comment. "It seems to me," she said gently to no one in particular, "that rosewater is a very specific fragrance. Not everyone wears it, and not everyone would choose it for such theatrical purposes." Edmund Ashford, the son, glanced up from his plate with genuine puzzlement. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple. I'm not entirely certain what you mean." "Oh, nothing of consequence," she replied, returning her attention to her soup. "Merely an observation about women's preferences. Catherine was quite devoted to her rose garden, wasn't she? I recall her mentioning it extensively at the vicar's tea last month. The comment seemed innocuous enough, barely worthy of notice, yet it had planted a seed, and Miss Marple, with the patience of one who had spent 84 years understanding the mechanics of human nature, was content to let it germinate in the fertile ground of guilty consciences. That night, as St. Clement's settled into uneasy sleep, Miss Marple sat by her window in her modest cottage on Church Lane, considering the architecture of the crime with the careful attention she might have given to a particularly complicated knitting pattern. Every element had its proper place, every thread, when followed carefully, would lead somewhere. The question, which she formulated with her customary precision, was not who had killed Catherine Ashford. That, she suspected, would become apparent soon enough. The question was why, and more intriguingly, how the wrong person had become the obvious suspect. The morning sun brought no clarity to St. Clement's, only a harsh illumination that made the village seem simultaneously more familiar and more alien than it had the day before. The newsagent's shop buzzed with speculation by 8 o'clock, and by 9, the story had undergone several transformations. By noon, Thomas Whitmore had become not merely a suspect, but in the minds of most villagers, the confirmed perpetrator of a crime born of some passionate obsession with a deceased woman. Inspector Hastings, however, was not entirely satisfied. He returned to Thornfield Manor on the second morning, with the demeanor of a man who sensed he was missing something, though he could not quite determine what. He found Miss Marple in the garden, examining the rose beds with the intensity one might reserve for a particularly absorbing puzzle. "Good morning, Inspector," she said without turning. "The heritage roses are truly exceptional this year. Catherine had a genuine gift for cultivation. It seems such a waste that her knowledge will die with her." Hastings was not accustomed to elderly ladies discussing botanical matters when murder investigations were pending, but he had learned not to dismiss Miss Marple's observations. She had, after all, proven instrumental in clarifying the Pemberton affair some years previous. "I've been reviewing the timeline," he said, settling into the role of conversational partner rather than interrogator. "Thomas Whitmore admits he was in the garden shed. No one can corroborate his presence. The ribbon, we've determined it matches materials kept in Catherine's sewing room. He would have had access, would he?" Miss Marple straightened, her hand resting lightly upon her walking stick. "I wonder if you've considered that access is rather different from opportunity, Inspector. The sewing room is in the east wing, is it not? And Catherine Ashford was murdered in the library, which is in the west wing. A considerable distance, and one that would require passing through several occupied areas of the house. During a garden party, no less, when servants and family members were moving about with considerable frequency." The inspector frowned. "U.S. I guess the ribbon was obtained elsewhere. I suggest nothing, Inspector. I merely observe that assumptions, however logical, sometimes bypass rather important details." She gestured toward the roses. "These flowers, for instance. Do you notice how some of the blooms have been recently pruned? Quite skillfully done, I might add. Thomas Whitmore's work, presumably. He is the groundskeeper, indeed. Which makes it rather curious that Catherine felt compelled to have a private conversation with him yesterday afternoon. I observed them quite clearly, you know. She was agitated, far more so than her public demeanor would suggest. And afterward, he looked rather as though he'd received some sort of directive. Hastings' expression shifted. This was precisely the sort of detail that constituted the difference between a competent investigation and a thorough one. Did you hear what was said? Regrettably not. The distance was too great, and my hearing, while adequate, does not extend to eavesdropping at such range. But I have been reflecting upon what might motivate such an urgent conversation between an employer and a young man newly employed, particularly when that conversation occurs with such obvious privacy concerns. The inspector's jaw tightened. He had been too hasty, allowing the obvious suspect to become the only suspect. It was a common error, one he recognized even as he'd committed it. "I believe I should have another conversation with Mr. Whitmore," he said, "and perhaps with the household staff. Someone may have overheard something of significance." By early afternoon, a picture had begun to emerge that rendered Thomas Whitmore's guilt considerably less certain. The head gardener, a man named Pearson, who had worked at Thornfield for nearly 20 years, admitted under gentle questioning that Thomas had confided in him the previous day. Catherine Ashford had discovered that Thomas was cultivating roses of his own, apparently to supplement his modest income by selling them to florists in the neighboring town. She wasn't pleased about it, Pearson explained. Said it was theft of her proprietary knowledge, or some such nonsense. I told the lad she was being unreasonable. Gardening knowledge isn't proprietary, it's just gardening. But Thomas was worried. He needed the position, you see. He's got a sister in London, ill, and he sends her money when he can. This revelation created an entirely different portrait of Thomas Whitmore. He was not a man driven by passion or obsession, but rather by desperation, the sort of desperation that made one vulnerable to accusation, but not necessarily to murder. A man worried about his employment was far less likely to commit a crime that would certainly terminate it. At 4 o'clock, Inspector Hastings called a gathering in the drawing room. Family, household staff, and the local constable assembled with varying degrees of anxiety. Miss Marple occupied her now familiar corner, her knitting needles moving with their steady hypnotic rhythm. "I must inform you," Hastings began, "that our initial assessment may have been premature. Thomas Whitmore is being released pending further investigation. However, this does not mean the matter is closed. Quite the opposite. It means we must look more carefully at the circumstances surrounding Catherine Ashford's death." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The ribbon used in the crime was, as we've established, kept in the sewing room. It's a common variety, available in any respectable haberdashery. What this means is that virtually anyone with access to this house could have obtained it. More significantly, the locked library suggests the killer either had a key or knew how to manipulate the mechanism from the outside. Richard Ashef. Ord's expression remained carefully neutral, but Miss Marple noticed his fingers tightening imperceptibly around the arm of his chair. Additionally, Hastings continued, we must consider motive more carefully. Catherine Ashford was not robbed. There was no sign of forced entry. This suggests someone she knew, someone to whom she would have granted access to the library, someone with whom she might have met privately. Edmund Ashford shifted uncomfortably. Victoria, the daughter, had grown quite pale. Jennifer Marsh, the farmer's wife, who had been briefly detained for questioning due to her conversation with Richard the previous day, gripped her husband's hand rather more tightly than seemed entirely necessary. "I intend to expand my investigation," Hastings said. "I shall require detailed statements from each of you regarding your activities and relationships with the deceased. Nothing more for the moment, but I suggest you all consider carefully what you may have witnessed or overheard during the garden party." As the assembly dispersed, Miss Marple remained in her chair, her knitting progressing steadily. She had observed something during Hastings's speech that the inspector, for all his competence, had missed. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, a momentary exchange of glances between Edmund Ashford and Frances Pemberton, the solicitor's daughter. It had lasted perhaps half a second, but in that half-second, Miss Marple had discerned something that transformed her understanding of the crime entirely. The matter was becoming considerably more intricate than simple murder. Somewhere beneath the surface of the apparent crime lay a network of relationships, secrets, and desperate motivations that would require careful navigation to untangle. And if her initial instincts were correct, the person who had murdered Catherine Ashford was someone whom the village, and Inspector Hastings, had not yet seriously considered. The village of St. Clement's had settled into the peculiar rhythm that followed scandal, a mixture of enforced normalcy and pervasive tension, as though everyone was performing roles in a play they had not chosen. Shops opened at their usual times, the vicar conducted his afternoon services, and life proceeded with the mechanical regularity that small communities employ to manage distress. Yet beneath this veneer, conversations shifted quickly when newcomers approached, and eyes followed the Ashford family with the intensity usually reserved for theatrical productions. Miss Marple spent the morning of the third day in her cottage, engaged in what appeared to be an extensive correspondence but was, in fact, a careful analysis of everything she had observed. She had written letters to 3 acquaintances, a former schoolmistress in Hampshire, a retired solicitor's clerk in Devon, and a cousin's daughter who worked in the records office in London. In each letter, buried among pleasantries about health and the weather, were specific inquiries about individuals connected to Thornfield Manor. Miss Marple had learned long ago that information, properly cultivated through established relationships, often proved far more illuminating than official channels. By afternoon, as she was arranging roses in a vase, not without irony, she reflected, there came a knock upon her door. It was Edmund Ashford, and his agitation was evident in the manner he held his hat and the frequency with which his gaze darted toward the street, as though concerned about being observed. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice considerably lower than social convention strictly required, "I wonder if I might speak with you privately. A matter of some delicacy." She invited him inside with the grace of one who had been expecting precisely this visitor, though natu rally. She gave no indication of her expectation. Edmund was a young man of perhaps 28, possessed of his father's pale eyes but his mother's darker colouring. He had spent the previous 10 years in London, engaged in some form of banking work, but had recently returned to the village under circumstances that the village gossips had not entirely settled upon. "I am troubled," he began, once he was seated, "by what I have not said to Inspector Hastings. It is a matter that concerns my family's reputation, you understand, and I have hesitated to reveal it. Yet I fear my silence may be impeding the investigation." Miss Marple set aside her knitting with an expression of patient attention. "I have found, Mr. Ashford, that silence often does more harm than the truth it attempts to protect." "What is it that troubles you?" Edmund took a breath as though steadying himself. "My mother and father's marriage was not entirely harmonious. This is not uncommon, I am aware, but in their case, the discord had become rather pronounced over the past several months. I returned to St. Clement's partly because of business matters, but also because my mother wrote expressing concerns about my father's behavior." "What manner of behavior?" "He had begun spending considerable time away from home, ostensibly on business, but my mother suspected he had formed an attachment elsewhere. Not simply a flirtation, you understand, but something rather more serious. She mentioned encountering him in conversation with Jennifer Marsh on several occasions, and the intimacy of their exchanges suggested something beyond casual acquaintance." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the attentiveness of someone filing away pieces of a puzzle. "And did your mother confront your father regarding this suspicion?" "I do not know directly, but I overheard an argument between them, approximately 2 weeks ago. My mother was quite harsh, making accusations that seemed to distress my father considerably. After that, the household became even more strained." "You did not mention this to Inspector Hastings? How could I?" Edmund's voice rose slightly in pitch. "The implication would be that my father had motive to murder my mother, if indeed he wished to continue his association with Mrs. Marsh without impediment. But my father is incapable of violence, Miss Marple. Whatever his personal failings, he is not a murderer." Miss Marple regarded him with the gentle scrutiny of one who had spent decades observing the human capacity for self-deception. "You must understand, Mr. Ashford, that motive is a complicated thing. Desperation, anger, and the fear of exposure drive people to actions they would not otherwise contemplate. However, I do not suggest your father is guilty of his wife's murder simply because he entertained unsuitable attachments elsewhere. Then, what should I do?" "You should tell Inspector Hastings precisely what you have told me. The truth, however uncomfortable, is preferable to silence. It is not your burden to determine your father's innocence or guilt. That is the inspector's task." Edmund departed shortly thereafter, looking somewhat relieved but not entirely reassured. Miss Marple watched him go from her window, observing the manner in which he glanced up and down the street before departing. The gesture suggested that his concern about being observed was not paranoia, but rather based in some actual anxiety about being seen in consultation with her. By evening, Inspector Hastings had received Edmund's confession regarding the marital discord at Thornfield. The inspector's demeanor shifted noticeably, a hardening of his features that suggested he believed he was moving closer to understanding the crime's architecture. He spent the remainder of the day conducting interviews with Richard Ashford, Jennifer Marsh, and several neighbors who might have observed inappropriate meetings between the two. It was during this process that Miss Marple made a discovery of her own. She had visited the village library on the pretext of returning a book, and had examined the lending records with the librarian, a woman named Miss Tompkins, who was, as it happened, the cousin of the headmaster at the village school. In the most casual manner possible, Miss Marple inquired whether anyone had recently withdrawn books on botany or horticulture. "Oh, yes," Miss Tompkins replied, consulting her records. "Thomas Whitmore borrowed a volume on rose cultivation 3 weeks ago, and quite curiously, young Francis Pemberton withdrew a book on poisons derived from plants approximately 2 weeks ago. I remember thinking it unusual for a girl her age to take such an interest in toxicology." The words hung in the air like a flower suspended in water, beautiful on the surface but containing depths that threatened to pull one under. Miss Marple's mind, which had been circling around certain patterns and possibilities, suddenly crystallized around a single terrible understanding. "Poisons, you say?" Miss Marple's voice remained placid, but her internal machinery was operating at considerable velocity. "How very unusual indeed." She departed the library with her mind racing through the implications of this revelation. The ribbon used in Catherine's murder had been red, not the typical choice for such violence. It had been deliberate, theatrical, almost ceremonial. And Frances Pemberton, the girl who had looked at Edmund Ashford with such intensity, had been researching the very subjects that might provide alternative methods of murder. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and retrieved the small bottle of rosewater that she kept for personal use. She examined it carefully, sniffing its contents and considering the nature of the scent. Rosewater was, fundamentally, a liquid preparation. It was also something that might mask other odors, might provide a plausible explanation for why Catherine had applied it without suspicion. The architecture of the crime was beginning to reveal itself, not as a simple act of passion or desperation, but as something far more calculated, something that required planning, knowledge, and a willingness to accept considerable risk. As Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the evening shadows lengthening around her, she began to contemplate which of the individuals connected to Thornfield Manor possessed all 3 qualities in sufficient measure. The 4th day of the investigation dawned grey and uncertain, as though the heavens themselves were reluctant to bear witness to what the morning might reveal. Inspector Hastings had developed a theory that seemed, on its surface, to possess considerable merit. Richard Ashford, driven by desire for Jennifer Marsh and motivated by the prospect of freedom from a marriage that had become intolerable, had murdered his wife. The locked library, Hastings now theorized, had been secured from within. Catherine, meeting her husband in private to discuss the dissolution of their marriage, had been attacked and strangled with the ribbon that represented, symbolically, the bonds she had refused to release. It was a narrative that satisfied most of the village's demand for resolution. Richard Ashford was taken into custody for further questioning, and though he maintained his innocence with an almost eerie calm, the weight of circumstantial evidence began to accumulate around him like sediment in still water. Yet Miss Marple remained unconvinced. She had spent the previous evening engaged in careful reflection, and she had arrived at a conclusion that seemed to contradict the inspector's reasoning at nearly every point. The locked library, she believed, was not the crucial detail everyone assumed it to be. The ribbon, theatrical and deliberate, suggested not the impulsive violence of a passionate man, but rather the calculated choreography of someone who wished the murder to appear in a particular light. On the morning of the fourth day, she drafted a note requesting an audience with Inspector Hastings. He arrived at her cottage by mid-morning, his expression suggesting the mixture of respect and faint exasperation that he had developed toward her over the years. "Miss Marple," he began, settling into the chair she indicated, "I appreciate your continued interest in this matter, but I must tell you that the evidence against Richard Ashford is becoming quite substantial. We have established motive through his affair with Jennifer Marsh, and his knowledge of the household's layout and security mechanisms eliminates the problem of access." "You have established one possible motive," Miss Marple corrected gently. "But tell me, Inspector, in your experience, how many husbands murder wives simply to be rid of inconvenient marriages? Surely divorce, however socially stigmatizing, would be preferable to murder in most rational minds." Hastings shifted uncomfortably. "Passion does not always operate through rational channels, Miss Marple." "Indeed not. But Richard Ashford does not strike me as a man governed by passion. Quite the opposite, in fact. He conducted his affair with considerable discretion, maintained his social appearances, and did not display the agitation one might expect from a man contemplating murder." "People are not always what they appear," Hastings said, though his tone suggested he was beginning to reconsider his position. "That is precisely my point, Inspector, which is why I have taken the liberty of inquiring into certain matters that I believe warrant your attention." Miss Marple retrieved a small leather notebook from her knitting bag. "I have been reflecting upon the timeline of events, and I have noticed something rather peculiar. Catherine Ashford's interest in Thomas Whitmore was not, as I initially assumed, merely concerned with his unauthorized rose cultivation." "What do you mean?" "I mean that I have made inquiries regarding Catherine's recent activities, and I have discovered that she had been quite actively involved in local charitable work. Specifically, she had taken a particular interest in assisting young women in difficult circumstances. I wondered why a woman of her social standing would involve herself in such work, particularly given that she seemed to prefer curating her public image rather carefully." Hastings leaned forward with renewed attention. "You suggest Catherine Ashford had knowledge of something she believed she should address?" "I suggest that Catherine Ashford may have discovered something regarding one of the young people in her household or close acquaintance that troubled her conscience sufficiently to motivate intervention. And that intervention may have proven fatal." The inspector's expression shifted as the implications began to take hold. "You believe one of the young people—" "I believe," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that you should examine more carefully the relationships between Edmund Ashford, Francis Pemberton, and Victoria Ashford. I believe you should consider whether Catherine's concern might not have been directed toward Thomas Whitmore at all, but rather toward individuals far closer to home." Hastings rose, his mind visibly working through the implications. "What specifically should I examine?" "I should begin with a conversation with Victoria Ashford regarding her inheritance, and with Francis Pemberton regarding her relationship with Edmund. And I would suggest you inquire most carefully into whether Catherine Ashford had recently modified her will." The inspector departed with considerably more purpose than he had arrived, leaving Miss Marple to contemplate the gathering shadows of the case. She had set certain mechanisms in motion, and now she could only observe how they played out. By afternoon, the investigation had taken a dramatic turn. Inspector Hastings had discovered, through consultation with Catherine's solicitor, that Catherine had indeed recently modified her will. More significantly, the new provisions had disinherited Edmund Ashford entirely, redirecting his substantial inheritance toward a charitable trust for assisting young women escaping difficult circumstances. This discovery, combined with renewed questioning of the household, had elicited a confession of sorts from Edmund. He admitted that his mother had confronted him 3 weeks prior with knowledge of his relationship with Frances Pemberton. Not merely a romantic relationship, but something considerably more troubling. Edmund had made Frances pregnant, and the two had been discussing marriage, which Catherine considered an inappropriate union given the Pembertons' status as mere professional people rather than gentry. My mother threatened to expose the entire matter, Edmund explained, his voice hollow. She said she would ensure that Frances was sent away, that I would be forced to marry beneath my station or face social ruin. She was quite adamant. She said she would not permit the Ashford name to be sullied by such a connection. The revelation sent ripples through the investigation. Here was clear motive. Edmund's inheritance threatened, his future compromised, his personal autonomy stripped away by a woman who wielded her social position as a weapon. But still, Miss Marple did not believe Edmund had murder. His mother. Desperation, yes. Motive, certainly. But not the careful planning that the crime itself suggested. It was Frances Pemberton, when questioned again, who provided the critical piece of the puzzle. Under gentle but persistent questioning from Inspector Hastings, she admitted that she had visited Thornfield Manor on the afternoon of the murder. She had come seeking Catherine Ashford, hoping to appeal to her reason regarding her relationship with Edmund. She had been in the garden, near the rose beds, when she observed something that had troubled her greatly. "I saw Thomas Whitmore," Frances said quietly, emerging from the library window. "It was quite strange, you understand. I thought it odd that he would be exiting from an interior room rather than simply using a door. I did not think to mention it at the time, as I was focused on my conversation with Mrs. Ashford, but I recall being quite curious about his activities." The statement hung in the air like a revelation finally made manifest. A window, not a door. A means of entry and exit that bypassed the locked mechanism entirely. And Thomas Whitmore, who had motive enough in the form of his employment dispute but whom everyone had assumed was innocent. Miss Marple listened as the inspector attempted to reconcile this new information with his current theory. But she understood something that Hastings, for all his competence, had not yet grasped. The crime possessed multiple layers, and each layer contained its own culprit, its own motive, its own desperate truth. What Miss Marple needed now was to determine which truth belonged to which crime, and whether the murder of Catherine Ashford was a single act, or the culmination of a conspiracy far more intricate than anyone had yet imagined. The questioning of Thomas Whitmore resumed with an intensity that suggested Inspector Hastings had arrived at a new and refocused understanding of the crime. Yet, as Miss Marple observed the proceedings from her position in the village constabulary's modest interview room, where the inspector had granted her the privilege of observation, recognizing the value of her insights, she detected something in the young groundskeeper's responses that contradicted the narrative that was taking shape. Thomas maintained, with consistent and genuine bewilderment, that he had not entered the library at any point on the afternoon of Catherine's murder. He acknowledged, when pressed, that he had indeed used the library window on previous occasions, as it provided a shortcut between the east and west gardens, without requiring him to pass through the house. But he insisted with increasing desperation that he had been nowhere near the library on the day in question. "I was in the shed, as I said," he repeated, his hands clenching into fists. "I had nothing to do with Mrs. Ashford's death. I was grateful for my position, despite what she said about the roses. I needed the work." Inspector Hastings, however, was not inclined toward leniency. The window evidence seemed damning, and Thomas's access to it was undeniable. A warrant for his arrest was being prepared when Miss Marple requested a private word with the inspector. "I do not believe Thomas Whitmore murdered Catherine Ashford," she said once they were alone in the inspector's makeshift office. "And I believe you are beginning to suspect the same?" Hastings set down his pen with a gesture of frustration. "Then explain to me, Miss Marple, how the library window constitutes evidence that does not implicate him. Frances Pemberton observed him emerging from that window on the very afternoon of the murder." "Frances Pemberton observed someone emerging from that window," Miss Marple corrected, "but observation, particularly in a garden setting with considerable distance and dappled light," filtering through trees, is remarkably unreliable. Young eyes often see what they expect to see, rather than what is actually present. And in this case, Frances was distracted, emotionally agitated, and focused upon her own concerns. You suggest she was mistaken? I suggest that we require considerably more specificity regarding the time of her observation. What hour precisely did she witness this emergence? How certain is she of the identification? And more importantly, who else possessed knowledge of the library window's utility as a means of access? The inspector's jaw tightened as the implications began to crystallize. You believe someone other than Thomas deliberately used the window, knowing it would direct suspicion toward him. I believe, Miss Marple said carefully, that we must consider the possibility that Catherine Ashford's murder was not a crime of passion, but rather a carefully orchestrated murder designed to appear as though it were. The theatrical nature of the ribbon, the deliberate locking of the library, these suggest premeditation and planning. And planning, Inspector, requires knowledge of one's subject and environment. Hastings rose and began to pace, his mind visibly reorganizing the facts he had accumulated. You mentioned earlier that Catherine had recently modified her will, that Edmund was disinherited. But Victoria, what of Victoria Ashford? What were the provisions regarding her inheritance? An excellent question, Miss Marple acknowledged. One that I suspect you are now preparing to investigate more thoroughly. By late afternoon, the investigation had shifted its focus entirely. Victoria Ashford, when questioned regarding her mother's recent activities and intentions, had revealed something that altered the entire landscape of motive. Catherine had discovered that Victoria had been conducting a clandestine romance with Robert, her cousin, the very same cousin who had been present at the garden party. More troublingly, Victoria had been using her mother's charitable connections to mask meetings between herself and Robert, leading Catherine to conclude that her daughter was engaged in a relationship of which she did not approve. My mother said she would speak with Father, Victoria explained, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. She said she would ensure that Robert was removed from our social circle entirely. She was quite cruel about it, actually. She said that my prospects would be damaged beyond repair if such an inappropriate association became public knowledge. The inspector pressed further, his questions becoming increasingly pointed. Did you express anger toward your mother regarding her threatened intervention? Victoria's silence provided its own answer, but eventually she spoke. I told her she was being unreasonable. I told her that if she insisted on controlling every aspect of my life, she would regret it. But I did not murder her, Inspector. Whatever anger I felt, I could never have done such a thing. Yet even as she spoke the words, Miss Marple observed something in Victoria's expression, a flicker of calculation that suggested depths far more complex than a simple romantic dispute. Victoria was intelligent, possessed of her mother's sharp features and her father's calculating nature. She had motive, access, and the household knowledge necessary to manipulate the circumstances of the crime. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage and reviewed everything she had learned. The case was becoming increasingly Byzantine, multiple motives, multiple suspects, multiple layers of deception and family discord. Edmund stood to lose his inheritance. Victoria had her romantic future threatened. Francis Pemberton had been caught in the machinery of fam, Ely politics and social expectation. Richard Ashford had conducted an affair that, while discretionary, might not have withstood Catherine's decision to expose it. But beneath all of these motives lay something deeper, something that suggested the crime was not simply about any single individual's desperation, but rather about a web of interdependent relationships and secrets. Catherine Ashford had positioned herself at the center of everyone's lives, controlling and manipulating through her control of information and resources, and someone had decided that her control had become intolerable. Miss Marple retrieved her small leather notebook and began to record her observations regarding the physical evidence. The ribbon itself, where had it come from? The rosewater scent, had it been applied by Catherine herself, or had it been deliberately applied by the murderer to create a false impression? The locked library, had it been locked to prevent interference or to direct suspicion toward someone with knowledge of the locking mechanism? As midnight approached, Miss Marple set aside her notebook and gazed out toward the darkness beyond her window. She had arrived at a conclusion that troubled her deeply, for it involved not one criminal but potentially two, their actions intertwined in such a manner that separating culpability from accident became nearly impossible. She had observed that the human capacity for self-deception was vast, and that people often participated in crimes without fully acknowledging their participation. Tomorrow, she decided, she would set a small trap, a test that would reveal which of her suspects possessed the specific knowledge and disposition necessary to commit murder. And that test would require her to position herself in considerable danger, for the murderer, once confronted with the possibility of exposure, might well become desperate in ways that transcended rational calculation. The fifth morning arrived with the peculiar stillness that precedes significant revelation. Miss Marple had sent identical notes to 3 individuals, Edmund Ashford, Victoria Ashford, and Francis Pemberton. Each note was carefully worded to suggest that Miss Marple possessed information of considerable delicacy regarding the murder, and that she wished to discuss the matter privately before bringing her conclusions to Inspector Hastings. The notes were dispatched with sufficient subtlety that no observer would detect in them anything beyond the polite correspondence of an elderly woman concerned with justice. By noon, Edmund had responded, requesting a meeting at 2 o'clock. Miss Marple had anticipated this response with reasonable certainty. Edmund was the sort of young man who would seek to contain information before it could spread further, and the possibility that Miss Marple might inadvertently reveal details regarding his involvement with Francis Pemberton would be sufficiently motivating to draw him out. He arrived precisely at 2, his manner anxious and his eyes darting about Miss Marple's modest sitting room as though searching for evidence of what she might have discovered. Miss Marple offered him tea, which he refused with barely concealed impatience. "I received your note," he began without preamble. "I am not certain what you believe you have discovered, but I must tell you that any information regarding my personal circumstances is precisely that, personal. My mother's death should not be used as an occasion to expose matters that are nobody's business but my own, and Francis's—" "Sit down, Mr. Ashford," Miss Marple said gently. "I have not invited you here to discuss your relationship with Francis Pemberton, though I suspect that matter troubles you considerably more than you initially indicated to Inspector Hastings." Edmund sat, his posture rigid with tension. "Then what is this about?" "It is about the fundamental question that Inspector Hastings has yet to adequately address, specifically who possessed both the motive and the precise knowledge of household mechanics necessary to stage the crime in such a theatrical manner." Miss Marple paused, allowing her words to settle. "The library window, for instance. How many people knew of its utility as a means of entry and exit? Thomas Whitmore, certainly, through his work in the gardens. But who else? I am not certain I follow your meaning." "I believe you do, Mr. Ashford. In fact, I believe you follow it quite clearly. What I wish to know is whether you were aware of your mother's intention to disinherit you before she was murdered, or whether you discovered this fact afterward through consultation with the family solicitor." Edmund's face paled, and his hand trembled slightly as he lifted his teacup with mechanical precision. "I do not see how this is relevant." "It is relevant because a son who knows himself to be disinherited possesses a particular emotional state, a desperation born of the knowledge that one's future has been deliberately stripped away. But a son who discovers his disinheritance after his mother's death possesses a different emotional state entirely. One of shock, certainly, but also of a certain complexity that comes from understanding that one has become a murder suspect precisely because one stands to inherit considerably more as a consequence of one's mother's death." "You are suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing, Mr. Ashford. I am merely observing patterns in behavior and attempting to determine which patterns are consistent with guilt, and which are merely consistent with the natural anxieties of a young man caught in difficult circumstances." After Edmund's departure, Miss Marple received Victoria within the hour. Victoria's approach was markedly different from her brother's. She entered with her head held high, her manner suggesting righteous indignation rather than anxiety. "I found your note rather insulting, Miss Marple," Victoria began without waiting for invitation to sit. "What information could you possibly possess that would be relevant to my mother's death?" "Sit down, Miss Ashford. I have several observations that I believe warrant your attention." Miss Marple gestured toward the chair Edmund had recently vacated. "Your mother was quite distressed by your relationship with your cousin Robert. She had threatened to intervene in a manner that would have effectively ended the possibility of marriage between you. Such interference must have been extraordinarily frustrating." "It was intolerable," Victoria said coldly. "But I did not murder my mother because she disapproved of my romantic choices." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But you did possess knowledge that might prove useful to someone who wished to commit murder and direct suspicion toward someone else. You knew, for instance, about the library window. You knew your mother's routines, and you knew that your father was engaged in an affair that would provide him with clear motive for murder." Victoria's expression hardened. "If you are suggesting that I assisted in my mother's murder, you are quite mistaken, and frankly I am insulted by the implication." "I am not suggesting anything of the sort," Miss Marple replied, "but I am observing that you possess a particular quality of detachment that suggests you have made peace with your mother's death rather more readily than one might expect of a grieving daughter. Most young women, confronted with their mother's murder, experience some measure of genuine distress. You, however, seem primarily concerned with ensuring that your romantic future remains unimpeded." When Victoria had departed, her exit notably more abrupt than Edmund's, Miss Marple sat quietly in her cottage and reflected upon what she had learned. Both Edmund and Victoria possessed motives, both had access to relevant knowledge, and both had demonstrated a certain compartmentalization of emotion that suggested they were not entirely unaccustomed to deception. But neither, Miss Marple suspected, had actually murdered Catherine Ashford. The final note had not been answered, and as evening approached, Miss Marple became increasingly certain that Francis Pemberton would not come at all. She was preparing her evening meal when there came a knock at her door that was neither gentle nor polite. It was forceful, insistent, the knock of someone driven by desperation beyond the bounds of social convention. Francis Pemberton stood on Miss Marple's threshold, her face flushed with emotion and her hands clenched at her sides. She had clearly received the note and had spent the day wrestling with its implications. "You know," Francis said without preamble, her voice tight and strained, "that is why you sent the notes. You have deduced who murdered Mrs. Ashford, and you believe it was me. Come inside, Miss Pemberton," Miss Marple said calmly, "and let us discuss precisely what you have done, and more importantly, whether you acted alone or in concert with others." As Francis stepped into the cottage, Miss Marple recognized in the young woman's expression something that had been absent from both Edmund and Victoria. Genuine guilt mingled with something far more dangerous. Desperation had driven Francis to murder, and desperation, once tasted, often bred additional crimes to cover. The first, the trap, it seemed, had been sprung more effectively than Miss Marple had anticipated. But the revelation of the trap's success brought with it no satisfaction, only the weary understanding that human nature, in its desperation to survive and flourish, often drove people toward precisely those actions that would destroy them most completely. Francis Pemberton collapsed into the chair that Miss Marple indicated, her body seeming to fold in upon itself as though the weight of her secrets had finally become too substantial to bear upright. For several moments she did not speak, her breathing shallow and rapid, her eyes fixed upon some point beyond the walls of the cottage. Miss Marple waited with the patience of someone accustomed to the mechanisms of guilt's revelation, allowing silence to do the work that words might only complicate. "I did not intend to murder her," Francis finally whispered, the words emerging as though dragged from some deep place of anguish. "You must understand that I did not set out to kill anyone." But she was so cruel, so deliberately intent upon destroying everything that Edmund and I had built together. "Tell me what happened," Miss Marple said gently. "Tell me precisely what occurred on the afternoon of the garden party." Francis took a breath, and the story began to unfold with the inexorable quality of a confession long suppressed. She had come to Thornfield Manor that afternoon, specifically to speak with Catherine Ashford, hoping against reason that she might appeal to the older woman's mercy. Edmund had been distant that morning, consumed by anxiety regarding his mother's threats, and Francis had decided that direct confrontation with Catherine was preferable to watching Edmund sink further into despair. I waited until the guests were occupied in the gardens, Frances continued. I knew the house from previous visits, and I made my way to the library where I thought she might be. I heard her voice inside, and I knocked upon the door. She opened it, and when she saw me, her expression became quite terrible. She said I was a brazen hussy, that I had seduced her son into an unsuitable attachment, that she would ensure I was expelled from society itself before she would permit such a union to proceed. Miss Marple listened without interruption, understanding that the act of confession required unimpeded flow, that any intervention might serve only to dam the river of guilt that had begun to break through its barriers. I told her that Edmund was a man capable of making his own decisions, Frances went on. I told her that her control was destructive, that she was poisoning her relationship with her son through her determination to manipulate every aspect of his existence. And she laughed, Miss Marple. She actually laughed. She said that I understood nothing of the world, that I was a foolish girl playing at adult emotions, and that within a month I would be forgotten while she would continue to exercise dominion over her son's life precisely as she had always done. The young woman's hands had begun to tremble, and Miss Marple observed in her face the particular anguish that came from remembering one's own capacity for rage. Something inside me broke, Miss Marple. Some restraint that I did not even know I possessed simply shattered. I saw the ribbon on her sewing table. She had been working on some cushion covering, and the ribbon was lying there, quite innocent, quite ordinary. And I thought about how she had used her words as weapons, how she had wounded Edmund repeatedly, how she intended to continue wounding him indefinitely. And I simply reached for the ribbon. You wound it about her neck, Miss Marple stated, not as a question but as a confirmation of facts she had already deduced. She fought me, Frances said, her voice dropping to barely audible. I did not expect her to fight. I thought perhaps she would simply fall, that the shock of violence might render her unable to resist. But she was quite strong, and she clawed at the ribbon, and she made sounds that I cannot describe, that I will never be able to unhear. And when it was finished, when she had ceased to move and to make those terrible sounds, I realized what I had done, and I became quite composed, quite composed. Miss Marple absorbed this confession with the gravity it deserved. You applied the rosewater after she was dead? Yes. Her bottle was on her dressing table. I thought that if I applied her own scent it might, I do not know what I thought precisely, that it might make her seem less dead, perhaps, or that it might mask the smell of violence. I am not entirely rational regarding that portion of events. And the library window. How did you exit? I heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. I did not think. I simply knew I must leave, and I recalled that Edmund had once mentioned the window. I opened it and lowered myself into the garden. I walked through the rose beds and emerged near the gate, where I was able to slip away without being observed. Except by Frances Pemberton, Miss Marple said quietly. Or rather, except by someone whom Frances Pemberton believed she observed emerging from that window. Frances's eyes widened with sudden understanding. Victoria. She saw me, and believed I was Thomas Whitmore because it was at a distance and her attention was divided. She did not deliberately lie to the inspector, she simply misidentified what she had observed. Yes, Miss Marple confirmed. Which made your deception considerably more complicated, because it was built upon Victoria's honest misidentification rather than upon deliberate conspiracy. Had Victoria clearly identified you, the case would have been resolved far more swiftly. Frances rose from her chair and moved toward the window, her gaze fixed upon the darkening street beyond. What will happen now? Will you contact Inspector Hastings immediately? I shall contact him this evening, Miss Marple said. But I wish first to understand one remaining matter. Did Edmund know what you had done? Did he assist you in any manner, or was he entirely ignorant of your actions? He was completely ignorant, Frances said with certainty. I did not tell him until this moment, and even now I have not told him in person. But when he discovered that his mother had disinherited him, when he realized the full scope of her intention to control his life even through the mechanism of financial deprivation, some part of me was relieved, because at least the thing I had done, The terrible thing I had done resulted in the removal of the source of his agony. Miss Marple understood in that moment the particular tragedy that underlay the crime. Frances had not murdered Catherine out of malice or even direct self-interest. She had murdered her because Catherine represented an obstacle to happiness that Frances had become convinced could not be overcome through any legitimate means. And in removing that obstacle, she had created far greater obstacles for everyone involved, most particularly for Edmund himself. "You should prepare yourself," Miss Marple said gently. "The legal consequences of what you have done are considerable. You will face trial, and the evidence against you is substantial. The only mitigating factor in your favor is that your crime appears to have been committed in the heat of emotional distress rather than through premeditation, though I suspect the prosecution will argue otherwise." Frances turned from the window, and Miss Marple was struck by how young she suddenly appeared. Not a woman driven to murder by passion, but simply a girl who had found herself in circumstances beyond her capacity to manage and had responded with the only tool she had at hand. "I should like to see Edmund before I am arrested," Frances said, "to explain what I have done and why." "I believe that can be arranged," Miss Marple said. "Inspector Hastings will likely require your presence at the station for formal questioning, but there may be opportunity for a brief conversation before official proceedings commence." As Miss Marple prepared to contact the inspector, she reflected upon the extraordinary complexity of the crime that had seemed, upon its surface, to be quite straightforward. Catherine Ashford had been murdered not through conspiracy or calculated planning, but through the eruption of a young woman's desperation in response to tyranny. And in being murdered, Catherine had paradoxically freed her son from the very control she had sought to maintain, though the cost of that freedom was a lifetime of knowing that it had been purchased with another's life. Inspector Hastings arrived at Miss Marple's cottage within 40 minutes of receiving her telephone call, his expression suggesting a mixture of exasperation and grudging admiration. He had been preparing to charge Thomas Whitmore with Catherine's murder based on the library window evidence, and the revelation that the actual culprit was Frances Pemberton represented both a complication and, in his professional estimation, a resolution that made considerably more logical sense than the scenario he had been constructing. Frances did not resist arrest. She surrendered herself with a composure that seemed almost rehearsed, as though she had been preparing for this moment from the instant she had murdered Catherine Ashford. She provided a detailed confession, corroborating every aspect of the crime Miss Marple had already deduced. The inspector listened to her account with the careful attention of a man cataloguing evidence for trial, his face remaining professionally neutral even as the tragedy of the crime became increasingly apparent. "I shall require a statement from you as well, Miss Marple," Hastings said once Frances had been conveyed to the police station. "Your investigative work has been, as always, both thorough and remarkably perceptive. How you arrived at the conclusion that Frances Pemberton was the perpetrator when the evidence so clearly pointed toward Thomas Whitmore is something I confess I do not entirely comprehend. It was largely a matter of observing what was absent rather than what was present," Miss Marple explained. "Thomas Whitmore possessed motive, certainly. His employment was threatened, and he harbored resentment toward Catherine regarding the matter of the roses. But he lacked a crucial element that any murderer requires, a compelling reason to believe that murder would improve his circumstances. Losing his position was undesirable, but it was not equivalent to losing his future, his reputation, and his capacity for happiness, in the manner that Frances believed her future was being stolen from her. You observed something in her behavior that indicated guilt." "I observed something in everyone's behavior," Miss Marple corrected. "Edmund's desperation regarding his disinheritance, Victoria's detachment regarding her mother's death, Richard's suspicious composure in the face of his wife's murder. But it was Frances's particular quality of guilt that seemed most profound. She had attempted to conceal it beneath a facade of anxiety regarding Edmund's situation, but the guilt was there nonetheless, evident in the manner she avoided direct eye contact and in the tremor that occasionally seized her hands." Hastings settled into the chair that Frances had recently vacated. "But observation alone could not have been sufficient to determine guilt. You must have possessed some additional piece of evidence that directed your suspicion toward her specifically." "Two pieces, actually," Miss Marple said. The first was the matter of the book on plant toxins that Francis had withdrawn from the library. Miss Tompkins mentioned it in passing, and I found it curious that a young woman would be researching such a subject. It suggested premeditation, or at the very least an active interest in methods of causing harm. However, it ultimately proved to be a red herring. Francis did not poison Catherine, though she had apparently considered the possibility before determining that direct violence would be more effective. And the second was more subtle. When I spoke with Francis in my cottage, I made a casual observation regarding rosewater being a particular choice of fragrance. I mentioned that Catherine had been quite devoted to her rose garden, and Francis responded to that observation in a manner that suggested she possessed knowledge of the rosewater's application to Catherine's body after death. Knowledge that, unless she had observed it being applied during the police investigation, could only have come from having applied it herself. The inspector frowned. She did not make such an observation in her confession. No, Miss Marple agreed, because she had not fully understood the significance of her own reaction until I provided her with the context in which that significance became apparent. She had applied the rosewater in a moment of shock and distress, not fully comprehending her own actions, and she had managed to suppress the memory of having done so until I inadvertently prompted her to recall it. Hastings rose and began to pace Miss Marple's modest sitting room, his mind clearly woe. Rucking through the implications of what he had learned, the case against her is substantial. Her confession, combined with the physical evidence and the testimony of Victoria Ashford regarding the library window, should result in a conviction. However, I confess that the legal and moral dimensions of this crime are considerably more complex than the typical murder case. She acted in the heat of passion rather than through premeditation. She had provocation in the form of Catherine's threat to her future happiness. And she is, by all accounts, a young woman of previously exemplary character. The law rarely concerns itself with the complexities of human motivation, Miss Marple observed. It concerns itself with facts and evidence, and the determination of guilt or innocence. But the consequences of law's application are always more complicated than the law itself acknowledges. Over the following days, St. Clement's village adjusted to the revelation that the murder had been committed by one of its own, a young woman from a respectable family who had lived among them without anyone suspecting her capable of violence. The vicar delivered sermons on the dangers of uncontrolled passion. The solicitor, Mr. Pemberton, withdrew from public life, his reputation damaged by association with his daughter's crime. The village matrons engaged in extensive discussion regarding the proper upbringing of young women and the management of romantic attachments before they could lead to catastrophe. Edmund Ashford visited Francis in the custody of the constabulary, a meeting that Miss Marple did not observe but whose emotional weight she could infer from the devastated expression Edmund wore upon emerging. He had loved Francis, and her confession had transformed her from the woman he loved into something far more complicated. A person capable of murder, driven by love for him to commit the ultimate act of violence. Richard Ashford, freed from suspicion regarding his wife's death, seemed uncertain how to proceed with his newfound liberty. His affair with Jennifer Marsh continued, though now undertaken with considerably less discretion, as though the death of his wife had freed him not only from marriage, but from the necessity of maintaining social pretense. He hired a solicitor to begin proceedings for the execution of Catherine's will, which meant that Edmund's disinheritance would proceed as Catherine had intended, with his substantial inheritance being redirected toward the charitable trust that Catherine had established. Victoria Ashford, initially relieved that suspicion had shifted away from her, gradually came to understand that the social consequences of being Catherine's daughter and a murder witness would follow her for some years. She withdrew her engagement with Robert, recognizing that the scandal surrounding her family made marriage to him impossible in the short term, though whether this separation would prove permanent remained unclear. Miss Marple observed all of these developments from her cottage window and from her position within the village's social circles. She had solved the crime, yes, but the solving of the crime had not brought about the restoration of peace or the correction of wrongdoing. Instead, It had merely illuminated the complex machinery of human nature and the manner in which desperation, love, and the desire for autonomy could combine to produce tragedy that encompassed far more than the single act of murder itself. The trial of Frances Pemberton took place on a grey October morning, 6 weeks after Catherine Ashford's death, in the county courthouse situated some 15 miles from St. Clement's. The proceedings attracted considerable attention from the local press, as murder trials involving young women of respectable family were sufficiently uncommon to warrant journalistic interest. Miss Marple attended the trial in her capacity as a crucial witness, though she had no expectation that her testimony would prove decisive in determining the verdict. The facts of the case were sufficiently established that her role was merely to corroborate what had already been admitted. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough. The Crown's solicitor presented Frances's confession, the physical evidence linking her to the crime, and the testimony of Victoria Ashford regarding the library window. He constructed a narrative of a young woman driven by desperate passion to commit murder, a narrative that emphasized the premeditated quality of her actions, the careful manner in which she had concealed her crime, applied rosewater to create confusion regarding the timing of death, and escaped through the library window with calculated precision. The defense, however, presented a different portrait. Frances's solicitor, a man named Carruthers, who possessed the quiet intensity of one accustomed to fighting against seemingly insurmountable odds, focused on the circumstances that had driven his client to violence. He called witnesses who testified to Catherine Ashford's pattern of controlling behavior, to her deliberate interference in her children's personal lives, to her use of financial leverage and social manipulation as weapons against those she deemed insufficiently obedient to her will. He called Edmund Ashford to the stand, where Edmund provided testimony regarding his mother's threats and ultimatums. He called the vicar, who spoke to Catherine's reputation for harsh judgment regarding matters of personal morality. He even called Thomas Whitmore, who provided testimony regarding the manner in which Catherine had threatened his employment over the matter of the roses, demonstrating a pattern of using the threat of economic ruin as a mechanism of control. Miss Marple observed the proceedings with careful attention, noting the manner in which jurors responded to the various testimonies. She observed the moment when several of the jurors' expressions shifted from viewing Frances as a cold-blooded murderer to viewing her as a desperate young woman driven to an act she might not otherwise have committed. She observed, too, the careful neutrality with which the judge presided, his face revealing nothing of his own assessment of the evidence. When Miss Marple was called to testify, she provided a straightforward account of her investigative process and the reasoning that had led her to conclude Frances was guilty. The prosecution's solicitor questioned her regarding her deductive methods, seemingly attempting to establish that her conclusions were based on intuition rather than evidence. Miss Marple responded with calm precision, explaining how each observation had built upon previous observations, how the absence of evidence could be as significant as the presence of evidence, and how the fundamental question of motive had ultimately proved decisive in determining the culprit's identity. "In your experience, Miss Marple," the prosecutor asked, "would you characterize the defendant's actions as those of a woman acting in the heat of passion, or those of a woman who had planned her victim's death with premeditation?" Miss Marple paused before responding, choosing her words with the careful deliberation that characterized her entire approach to the investigation. "I would characterize the defendant's actions as those of a woman whose emotional distress had reached such a critical point that she became capable of violence she would not otherwise have committed. Whether one terms this premeditation or passion is largely a matter of definition. The defendant had been considering the possibility of violent action for some period of time, as evidenced by her research into plant toxins. However, the actual commission of the crime appears to have been impulsive, arising from a confrontation that exceeded the defendant's capacity to manage through rational means. The defense's solicitor, on cross-examination, pressed Miss Marple to elaborate on the circumstances that had driven Frances to her desperate act. "In your view, Miss Marple, was the defendant acting in self-defense, protecting her future against a woman who had made clear her intention to destroy that future?" "I would not characterize it as self-defense in the legal sense," Miss Marple replied, "but I would characterize it as arising from a young woman's belief that her future was under deliberate and imminent threat, and that no other means of protecting that future remained available to her. The trial continued for 3 days, and by its conclusion, the evidence was sufficiently complex that the jury's deliberation extended through the evening and into the following morning. When they finally returned a verdict, it was not one of simple guilt or innocence, but rather a conviction on a charge of murder with a strong recommendation for mercy based on the circumstances surrounding the crime. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, acknowledged the jury's recommendation. The court recognizes that the defendant acted under extreme emotional distress and that the victim's behavior contributed significantly to the circumstances that led to this crime. However, the law does not p.e. RMIT violence as a response to emotional suffering, however justified that suffering may seem to the individual experiencing it. The court therefore sentences Frances Pemberton to imprisonment for life, with eligibility for parole after 20 years, in recognition of both the severity of the crime and the mitigating circumstances under which it was committed. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of reactions. Frances's family wept quietly. Edmund Ashford, who had remained present throughout the trial, stared at his hands with an expression of profound loss. The journalists scribbled frantically in their notebooks, already composing the headlines that would announce the verdict to the wider world. Miss Marple, observing it all with her customary composure, felt a profound weariness settle over her. She had solved the crime, yes. She had ensured that justice, in its legal formulation, had been served. But in doing so, she had brought about the imprisonment of a young woman who had murdered not out of malice, but out of desperation, and she had set in motion consequences that would ripple through St. Clement's Village for years to come. As she departed the courthouse, Richard Ashford approached her. His expression was difficult to read, neither grateful nor reproachful, but rather something more complex. "You were quite right about everything, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Frances did not act alone, though she bore the burden of the crime alone. My wife's tyranny extended far beyond what even you initially understood. But I suspect you knew that as well." Miss Marple regarded him with her characteristically penetrating gaze. "I knew that Catherine's death served many purposes for many people, Mr. Ashford, but knowing that people might have benefited from her death is not equivalent to knowing that they participated in causing it. Your knowledge and your guilt are distinct. Tea matters, and I've been careful not to confuse them." Richard nodded and departed, leaving Miss Marple alone on the courthouse steps as the October wind swept through the streets of the county town. She had set out to solve a murder, and she had succeeded, but the resolution had brought not peace but only a different configuration of human suffering, and that recognition settled heavily upon her shoulders as she made her way back toward St. Clement's Village. The autumn months following the trial transformed St. Clement's Village in ways both subtle and profound. The vibrant reds and golds of October gave way to the grey dampness of November, and with the changing seasons came a gradual shift in the village's collective consciousness. The scandal that had consumed everyone's attention began to fade into the background of daily life, though it did not disappear entirely. Scandals, Miss Marple had long ago learned, were like stains on fabric. They might fade with time and repeated washing, but traces of them remained visible to anyone who cared to look closely. She had returned to her cottage on Church Lane to find it precisely as she had left it, unchanged by the extraordinary events that had transpired. Her knitting remained in the basket beside her chair, incomplete sweaters and scarves awaiting the needles that had been temporarily diverted towards solving murder. Her garden, tended by young William from the village, had been maintained with commendable care. Life, it seemed, had the remarkable capacity to continue even when human lives had been fundamentally disrupted. It was on a particularly grey afternoon in late November that Edmund Ashford appeared at her door. He had been absent from St. Clement's for several weeks following the trial, and his return suggested a man who had come to some form of resolution regarding his circumstances. Miss Marple invited him. Inside with her customary grace, though she sensed that this visit carried different weight than his earlier appearance seeking to contain scandal. "I have come to thank you," Edmund said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her, "though I suspect my gratitude is rather more complicated than simple thanks ought to be. You uncovered the truth regarding my mother's death, and in doing so, You ensured that the law was served and justice, in its fashion, was accomplished. But you also ensured that Frances would spend the next 20 years imprisoned for an act that, while inexcusable, arose from circumstances that extended far beyond her individual responsibility. Yes, Miss Marple said simply, that is the nature of law. It concerns itself with individual culpability rather than systemic responsibility. Frances murdered your mother. That is an objective fact. But your mother's pattern of control and manipulation created the environment in which that murder became possible. Both things are true simultaneously, and law has no mechanism for acknowledging both truths equally. Edmund was quiet for a long moment. I have been visiting Frances regularly, he continued. The prison authorities have been surprisingly accommodating regarding visits. She has expressed genuine remorse for what she has done, but she has also spoken extensively about the circumstances that led her to commit the act. I have come to understand, through her words, how completely my mother had dominated every aspect of her life, and how thoroughly she had been willing to sacrifice her own future to prevent my mother from destroying mine. Love, Miss Marple observed, is a curious force. It drives people toward both the most noble and the most destructive actions. Your mother loved you, I believe. Though her love manifested itself in the form of control, Frances loved you as well, though. Her love manifested itself in the form of murder. Both were expressions of the same fundamental emotion, yet their consequences were entirely different. Do you believe Frances will ever forgive herself? Edmund asked. Do you believe redemption is possible for someone who has committed such an act? Miss Marple considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. I have observed that people are far more capable of forgiving themselves than justice systems are willing to forgive them. Whether that capacity for self-forgiveness represents genuine redemption or merely a convenient form of self-deception is a question I have never been entirely able to answer. But I have learned that holding on to guilt serves no one, and that eventually most people find ways to incorporate their worst actions into narratives that allow them to continue living. Whether that is wisdom or tragedy depends largely on one's perspective. Edmund rose to depart, but Miss Marple detained him with a gentle observation. Your mother's death has freed you from her control, though I do not believe you will find that freedom entirely pleasant. Freedom purchased at such a cost is rarely unmixed with regret. But you possess the opportunity that your mother denied herself, the opportunity to learn from her mistakes and to construct a life that does not depend on the domination or manipulation of others. I trust you will use that opportunity wisely. After Edmund's departure, Miss Marple spent the evening reflecting upon the case in its entirety. She retrieved her small leather notebook and reviewed her observations, noting how each thread had eventually led to the complete tapestry of the crime. The ribbon, the rosewater, the library window, the inheritance dispute, the botanical research. Each element had possessed significance, yet none possessed significance in isolation, only when considered. As part of the whole did the crime's architecture become apparent. She thought about Catherine Ashford, a woman who had controlled so thoroughly that she had ultimately been murdered by someone she sought to control. She thought about Frances Pemberton, a young woman whose capacity for love had transformed into capacity for violence. She thought about Edmund, Victoria, and Richard, each of them damaged in different ways by Catherine's presence and by the manner of her death. The case had revealed nothing particularly surprising about human nature. Miss Marple had long understood that people were capable of remarkable cruelty in pursuit of what they believed to be their own good. She had understood that families were crucibles in which the most intense human emotions, love, resentment, desperation, and rage, combined in ways that frequently proved explosive. She had understood that justice, while necessary, was rarely sufficient to address the complexity of human suffering. What the case had reminded her of, however, was the importance of observation over assumption, of patience over haste, and of recognizing the limitations of law in addressing the full spectrum of human wrongdoing. Frances Pemberton had committed murder, and the law had rightly pronounced her guilty. But Catherine Ashford had committed numerous smaller crimes against the autonomy and dignity of those around her. and the law had no mechanism for addressing those crimes at all. As November rain began to patter against her windows, Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The incomplete sweater awaited her needles, its pattern requiring careful attention and considerable patience. She had learned long ago that the work of her hands provided the ideal accompaniment to the work of her mind. As her needles moved in their familiar rhythm, she considered the patterns she had observed in the Ashford case, and reflected upon what those patterns revealed about the nature of human relationships and the mechanisms by which ordinary people came to commit extraordinary acts. St. Clement's village, beyond her windows, had largely returned to its customary routines. The scandal had faded into village history, relegated to the category of stories that would be told and retold at tea gatherings for years to come. The Ashford name carried some diminishment in social standing, though such things were remarkably flexible in rural communities where family connections ultimately mattered more than temporary scandal. Miss Marple knew that life would continue in St. Clement's much as it had before, with all its petty intrigues, its hidden resentments, and its careful maintenance of social facades. She knew too that within that continued life there would be other crimes, smaller ones perhaps, or at least less immediately apparent ones. And should the village require her quiet wisdom and her careful observation, she would be available, as she always had been. A grey and unremarkable elderly woman occupying her cottage on Church Lane, knitting and observing and understanding far more than anyone suspected. The case of Catherine Ashford's murder had been solved, the guilty party had been imprisoned, and justice had been served according to law. But as Miss Marple contemplated the patterns that had led to tragedy, she recognized that some mysteries could not be fully resolved, and some wounds could never be entirely healed. All that remained was to observe, to understand, and to continue living with the knowledge that human nature, in all its complexity and contradiction, would continue to surprise and confound her for whatever years remained to her. The Rosewater scent had long since dissipated from Thornfield Manor, and Catherine Ashford herself had become merely memory. But the patterns behavior that her life had embodied, the desperation she had inspired in others, and the tragedy that had resulted from her tyranny, these remained, woven into the fabric of St. Clement's village like threads in a carefully constructed tapestry.